What's the difference between an optical viewfinder, an electronic viewfinder, and the screen on the back of your camera? I'm going to break it all down and help you decide which one you should be using, all on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question, you know what to do. Just go to askdavidbergman.com, submit that form on the site, and I just might pick your question to answer right here on a future show. Today's question comes from Zephaniah, who wants to know, is there a difference when using autofocus through the EVF versus live view? Thanks for sending that in, Zephaniah. I do certainly appreciate it. Now, what I'm going to do today is go through the primary viewing methods that photographers use to compose their images. You mentioned two of them, but there are actually three, and there are various pros and cons of each. I'm going to try to spell them all out, and then after that, I'll talk about how autofocus works on each one to answer your specific question. Now first, let's do the one that you didn't mention, the optical viewfinder, or OVF. A viewfinder is simply what you look through in your camera to compose your image. So optical viewfinder just means there's an optical path for the light to go to your eye. When looking through an OVF, you see the scene in real life through the lens using a system of mirrors. The main mirror reflects the light up into the viewfinder so you can see your subject. And when you press the shutter, that mirror flips up out of the way and light goes straight through and hits the sensor to capture the image. Now, the biggest advantage of an OVF is that there's no lag. You're seeing everything as it happens, which makes it perfect for fast action like sports or wildlife. But since it's purely optical, you won't see your exposure, white balance, or other settings in real time. You pretty much need to know what you're doing to be able to get the shot as you want. Next, let's talk about the electronic viewfinder, or EVF, which you'll find on most modern mirrorless cameras. With an EVF, instead of looking directly through the lens optically, you see a little digital screen, kind of like a tiny TV that shows a live preview of your image even before you press the shutter button. The big advantage is that you can see how settings like exposure, white balance, and contrast will affect your shot in real time. What you see is what you get when you press the shutter. As for the downsides, well, there's some processing before the image is displayed, so that could lead to slight lag, especially in older models. The screen resolution also might not look exactly like real life, but with newer cameras like the Canon R5 Mark II, the EVF is incredibly sharp and responsive, getting really close to what feels like an optical viewfinder. Just keep in mind that EVFs use more battery power since the screen is always on, so make sure you bring extra batteries when you're out in the field. Lastly, live view is when you use the screen on the back of your camera to shoot. You get the same real-time feedback as an EVF, and you can see how your settings like exposure and white balance affect the shot before you take it. In mirrorless cameras, the image you see on that screen is identical to what you see in the EVF, and most cameras switch automatically between the two once you bring your eye up to the viewfinder. On DSLRs, however, the mirror has to move when you switch to live view, so you can't use the optical viewfinder when that back screen is active. So why would you choose to use live view? Well, since many screens now tilt or swivel, it's ideal for shooting from awkward angles like up high or down low. It's also nice when you're working on a tripod for things like landscapes and macro or even nighttime shots. But there are some trade-offs. The screen can be hard to see in bright sunlight, and holding the camera out in front of you can cause more camera shake, especially if you're shooting handheld for long periods of time. Plus, just like the EVF, it does drain your battery, so plan accordingly for that. So those are the three most common methods photographers use to compose and create images. Now let's get to the question about autofocus, because the focusing systems can work differently depending on which method you're using. First, DSLRs. Autofocus works differently depending on whether you're using the optical viewfinder or live view on a DSLR. When you're using the OVF, the main mirror directs some of the light down to a dedicated autofocus sensor, while the rest of the light goes up to the viewfinder so you can see the scene. This system is incredibly fast for tracking moving subjects, but when you switch to live view, the mirror flips up, blocking that dedicated sensor, and the camera relies only on the imaging sensor to focus. This method is actually quite a bit slower, which is why live view is better suited for still shots like portraits or landscapes where you really have more time to focus. Now, mirrorless cameras don't have two separate autofocus methods like DSLRs. Focusing is done directly off the imaging sensor every time. Because these cameras have all the latest technology and processing power, this sensor-based autofocus is designed to be as fast or even faster than the optical focusing method on a DSLR. The R5 Mark II has blackout-free shooting as an option as well, which allows you to shoot in burst mode without ever losing sight of your subject. It also has cool new things like eye-controlled autofocus, where the camera focuses exactly where you're looking at in the viewfinder. Now, if you switch to live view, the autofocus system works the same way as the EVF, but you're just composing your shot on the rear screen instead. Many mirrorless cameras have things like touch to focus, which means that you can tap the screen to set your focus point, kind of like you do on your phone. For fast-moving subjects, relying on the viewfinder for tracking is usually more practical than trying to touch that focus all the time. So Zephaniah, if you're using a DSLR, I'd say avoid autofocus in live view and stick to the optical viewfinder. But since you asked about EVF versus live view, that probably means you're using a mirrorless camera. As I mentioned, the focusing systems for both the EVF and live view on a mirrorless are virtually identical. So from a technical standpoint, you're fine either way. Having said that, I personally am team EVF 99.9% of the time. I like having my eye pressed up against the viewfinder to block out as much ambient light as possible and really focus on the shot I'm trying to create. It's also more stable than holding the camera out in front of me, and I don't have to worry about glare from the sun. I will use the screen when I need to shoot from awkward angles or when I'm working on a tripod for the reasons I talked about before, but I don't honestly do that very often. At the end of the day, look, it's really about finding what works best for you in any particular situation. Whether you're more comfortable with an optical viewfinder, an electronic viewfinder, or the rear screen, each one has its own pros and cons. There's no right or wrong way to shoot, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Before 35mm cameras were so common, medium format photographers had plenty of options as well. Some chose to use eye-level prism finders, while others used waist-level finders or even range finders. So just figure out which method suits your style and go make some great images. What do you all think? Do you prefer using live view or the EVF? Do you look down on people who hold the camera out in front of them? Let me know down in the comments below. Remember, if you've got your own photography questions, head on over to askdavidbergman.com and send that to me. Maybe I'll answer it here on a future show. If you like this video, I do appreciate you hitting that like button, and of course subscribing to the Adorama YouTube channel. Make sure you click that bell icon down there so you'll be notified when new videos come out from myself and all the other photo hosts right here on Adorama TV. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you back here next time right here on Ask David Bergman.